Hey everyone, it's Vivi and welcome. Looking at the big picture, Ratchet & Clank is known for having a pretty extensive library of games. We had 4 games on the PlayStation 2, 6 games on the PlayStation 3, 1 on the PlayStation 4, and then finally, Rift Apart on the PlayStation 5. If we count other studios, we had Size Matters on the PSP and PS2. The same applies for Secret Agent Clank as well. So just taking all of that into account, yes, in terms of actual installments, Ratchet & Clank is pretty big. Then again, I still feel it's even bigger than we think. One thing I've probably mentioned time and time again, Rift Apart has most likely brought in new players. The game is appealing to the eye, it's fun, and stands quite well on its own. Rift Apart is its own thing. As for veterans and long-time fans, the game features references and Easter eggs. But looking at the big picture, Rift Apart lays the foundation of our duo, 2 best friends who've been on multiple adventures in the past and are seen as heroes. New players to the franchise got to experience what it's like to explore the universe as Ratchet & Clank. And hey, if they want to experience even more Ratchet & Clank, the whole series is available for streaming on PS Plus Premium. This was their way of celebrating its 20th anniversary, even added a whole new armor pack free extension for Rift Apart. So speaking of the game's universe, if you look at what's actually new to everyone, it's Rivet and Kit. That alone, the love and attention these 2 characters have garnered, it just makes you wonder, do they hold enough potential to branch out in the series? By this I mean prequels, spin-offs, comics even. I'll say this again, more Ratchet & Clank comics, especially prequels, would be a fantastic way to answer whatever question it is that keeps lurking around. One example would be, what was the Resistance actually like? How did Rivet work solo this whole time prior to meeting Kit? Something along those lines could get explained via a comic. They could take Marvel's Spider-Man route, a free digital prequel comic before the next anticipated sequel. Another example, just for the heck of it, seeing as how Kit is perceived as Clank's dimensional counterpart, what was it like working for the Emperor? After all, he created Kit, at least that's what we're meant to believe. In Clank's case, we found out he had Zoni origins. His father, leader of the Zoni, Orvis, was his creator. Are we to believe there's dimensional variants of the Zoni or even Orvis? Or are they just one in the multiverse? If not for Kit, Rift Apart also mentions the name Kaidan, Ratchet's father. If you've ever played A Crack in Time, Kaidan had a best friend named Alistair Azimuth who unfortunately saw their end. He tried to toy with the Great Clock in order to undo his mistake. A prequel game, for instance, could dive into the adventures of Kaidan and Azimuth. However, as much as these sound very intriguing, there's always the challenge of just getting it out there. Longtime fans might love the idea of a prequel game, but as for newcomers, it might cause confusion. Kaidan's not Rivet, nor Ratchet. Azimuth is not Clank, nor Kit, vice versa. So there's definitely that challenge of trying to make these appealing enough for this new audience. If there's one game that doesn't involve Ratchet & Clank, and could capture attention potentially, it's a Rivet and Kit game. Whether this would be a prequel or a spin-off / sequel kind of thing is up in the air. Thing is, we can't deny the attention these 2 got in Rift Apart, especially Rivet. As for what the premise of such game would be, explore more of Rivet and Kit's dynamic. Comics could also market the next game, for example. Think of something like Crash Team Rumble, how Cat-Bat, this new character to the franchise, got their own little backstory. Come to think of it, during the days of Ratchet Deadlock's release, we had a short digital comic starring Captain Starshield. Starshield was one of the contestants at Dread Zone who sadly met their end. This comic acted as a little prequel to Deadlocked. This comic was released in October 2005, a week before Deadlock's release. So another scenario like this for a future Ratchet & Clank game would be fantastic. Here's a little fun fact. Former writer of the series, TJ Fixman, writer before Rift Apart to put it differently, had envisioned the idea of a novel, and yes, it had to do with Caden and Azimuth. This tweet dates back to 2018. Just looking back, what if we had a prequel novel, assuming it would have been full-fledged? Where would the series even be today, right? The Lombax lore still seems to be dangling in front of us. We still wonder when we'll get to actually see this other dimension. So again, if we had a prequel novel back then, would we still be wondering about the Lombaxes to the extent we are today? If anything, Rift Apart seems to be heavily hinting at the Lombax dimension, us actually finally getting to see this place. And heck, I won't be surprised if our heroes realize it's not what they were expecting. A scene I bring up time and time again, Ratchet wonders the same. Could be foreshadowing, perhaps. If we think back to previous mediums, we had the movie, which unfortunately didn't perform well, and then we had this little thing out there in the wild, an animated short titled Life of Pi. If you've never heard of it, well, that's because this was exclusive to Canada. Some say this acted as a pilot, an attempt to test the waters sort of thing. This episode had all original voice actors, by the way. As for when this was worked on, we'd like to believe this was explored after the movie. Rainmaker, the company behind the film, rebranded as Mainframe, and that's the name we see during this short. This was released on Canadian network Crave back on February 12th, 2021, and was not considered canon to the series' main line of games. All we do know is that this never released outside of Canada and it felt forgotten. The idea of an animated show was never re-explored. But who really knows what lies in the future? If we think about it, even if the movie underperformed, it didn't stop curious minds to animate a whole entire one-off episode. These days, we have PlayStation Productions, Sony's own library of movie and TV shows based on their IPs. Who knows, perhaps one day they'd re-explore this idea of a Ratchet Clank TV show, this time under PlayStation Productions, of course. Ratchet is, after all, PlayStation's side of more family-friendly genres, and Sony keeps acknowledging it. Last but not least, we can't forget the fact that Rift Apart is coming to PC soon. If there's one thing we're all waiting to see, mods. I feel the modding community will have a field day with this one. I can already imagine old school Ratchet skin being modded in there. That aside, all these mods, whatever creativity or nostalgia will come across, it's gonna get even more folks talking about this game. Not to mention more players having access to this game. One last thing I want to say. Let's imagine a certain scenario, more of a dude can dream type of thing. Looking at Rift Apart, we have the Lorbs. Sly's universe was referenced, as well as Jack, among others. As much as we'd like to imagine it, however, there is a caveat. Ratchet & Clank is the only current active IP among this trio. If Sly and Jack had more games, it perhaps would have upped the chance of having another Sly, Jack, Ratchet crossover. Think of it as cross-marketing all these IPs together. And no, not something like PlayStation Move Heroes, something with a much deeper narrative and gameplay. That's what I'd love to see. Hard to imagine at this point in time. A crossover would really depend of the rest. At least this is coming from a personal perspective. After all, when PlayStation Move Heroes happened, we had Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier released 2 years prior, and then Sly Thieves in Time 2 years after. So those characters were still, I'd say, active during that period. They were still fresh. Before I wrap up this video, here's a question to you who's watching right now. If we had another crossover, would you imagine it falling in line with the timeline of these universes? You know, making it canon? In other words, would you picture this taking the Marvel approach? Making it canon to all these games? What do you think? Feel free to share your thoughts, and as always, thank you to my patrons for their awesome support on Patreon, and thank you for all of you who's watching. You can call me Vivi, and until next time.